Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar series titled Manage Microsoft 365 Security Risks. Today's speaker will be Aaron Turner, CTO of SaaS Protect. Aaron will share a little bit about himself in a couple minutes, but I can assure you you'll be in great hands. So to cover some housekeeping items before we get started, if you have any questions, please type them in the question box on the bottom of your console. We'll address as many as time permits. And a recording of this webinar will be provided after. So stay tuned for that. And with that, thank you, Aaron. And let's go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Sri. So when you think about the challenges that we have when we move to cloud environments, and so many organizations have done that, whether it was for Exchange Online for messaging, or Azure Active Directory for single sign-on, or Teams for collaboration, or OneDrive for file sharing. So many organizations, the latest statistics suggest over 90% of organizations that have moved in some way to the Microsoft Cloud. And so what Vectra has done is they've made a huge investment to help spread across all aspects of the NIST cybersecurity framework, from identification of problems to protection and hardening of the environment, to detection and response and recovery in the event that bad things happen there. And so with the combination of Vectra's products and services, we've tried to make it so that we really are helping across the entire spectrum of the security problem. And I'm really proud to be leading the organization that is the Vectra Protect world, where we are building out a new way to think about hardening that cloud environment. I've done this based upon the Sirius Microsoft 365 scan. And this is something that I developed back in April of 2020, and that Vectra acquired in January of this year to make the core of their Protect platform. Some more background about myself. I've been doing some form of cybersecurity for 30 years now. I've worked on both the cyber warfare side of things for the US government and its allies, as well as the information assurance angle, working in over 90 countries around the world, helping to harden systems and protect them from some of the world's best attackers. And when I created the Sirius Microsoft 365 scan, I was really inspired by many of the great vulnerability scanners from the past. I had the opportunity to work with the guys at Foundstone, who started the FoundScan scanner back in the late 90s. Which was later acquired by McAfee. I count as a good friend the guys who invented the Nessus scanner that's part of the Tenable platform. I worked with the folks who developed Metasploit, and I really took all of that inspiration and said, what can we do to develop a scanner that scans the infrastructure as code that exists inside of these SaaS platforms? Because traditional vulnerability scanners are IP address based, not infrastructure as code based. And so over the last now 3 years, we've worked and spent over 50,000 hours of research and development with some of the best Microsoft 365 experts from around the world. And so what we've done is taken all of this expertise from my days at Microsoft when I won awards from Bill Gates, to the time that I spent for the US government doing cyber warfare, to the years of research that I did around the world, to bring that all together in a way that benefits Vectra customers with our Protect platform. So why is it that we did this? Well, over the last 2 years, over 100,000 companies around the world have been compromised through Azure Active Directory and Exchange Online. And these range from the attacks on the US Treasury in March of 2020, all the way to what's happening day to day today. And why do these attacks happen is because of weak default configurations inside of Microsoft 365, as well as administrative failures and errors that are made when the environments are set up. So whether it's the nation state attacks that began with the Treasury attacks, such as those in March of 2020, or the widespread attacks that took place with Novelium, you can see the trending here is from March of 2020 through today, there are hundreds of thousands of organizations which have been compromised because of these weak default settings, and possibly because administrators left a few doors and windows open that they shouldn't have. And so we wanted to create a system that would allow us to programmatically, repeatably, and measurably analyze the infrastructure as code that sits behind Microsoft 365 to look for these types of problems. Now, if you think about root cause analysis, why are these attacks happening? Well, anyone who's gone and migrated to the Microsoft Cloud knows that it is an extremely complex environment. there are over 7,500 settings per user that can be configured, and that's just for an E3 license. If you go to the E5 license, there's thousands of more settings that can be configured. And Microsoft changes that environment from time to time that can sometimes lead to configuration drift. Also, the administrator of your tenant may be making changes that are not properly reverted. And because there is no centralized administration interface for all of these services, it's distributed across dozens of different portals. And so what ends up happening is organizations are forced to use PowerShell to go and manage this platform. And for those of you not familiar, the blue screen on the left here is a PowerShell terminal window. This is not an intuitive nor easy way to go and look at these problems. The screenshot on the right here is an example of a manifest from a user. So imagine thousands of lines of this code that basically tells the Microsoft 365 platform which services are enabled and disabled, which security settings have been configured and which ones haven't. And so because of this really poor user interface, it creates confusion, and it's not very well documented. So organizations and their administrators sometimes get confused about what they need to do. And as Microsoft releases more applications and configuration options, this user manifest grows and grows and grows. And so attackers have really taken advantage of this situation so that they can go and abuse these settings in a way that is to their benefit. And so if you think about what is available inside of the Microsoft platform, they do have the Defender Secure Score. And that Secure Score can help you, but you have to realize that it only really analyzes 23 settings that we think are material when it comes to known attacks. And most Microsoft 365 Secure Score analysis is used on a global and not necessarily an individual basis. And so you don't really get a true picture of everything that's out there. Our research, we've taken a look at it, and we think that organizations should be monitoring for over 150 settings, not 23. And so what we've done is make sure that we can go across Azure AD Identity, Exchange Online Mailbox, and OneDrive shares in a meaningful way to look at things. And so with this process, we've tried to make it so that organizations can look at the complexity of these attacks and whether the organization has been hardened to the point where it can resist these problems. So let's take a look at the March to September of 2020 campaigns and how those ran. So first we started with the FireEye tool proliferation, and then we had the SolarWinds supply chain attack, which resulted in an on-premises privileged user identity problem. But those on-premises privileged users were then used to pivot into the Microsoft 365 tenant because the attackers knew that that's where the organization was weakest. They were not properly monitoring the Microsoft 365 environment. They had not properly hardened it. And so when you take a look at this MITRE ATT&CK framework view of these attacks, you can see all of these red cells lit up. And each one of these red cells is an attack framework or an attack pattern that can be run through a PowerShell command if someone gains privileged access to a Microsoft 365 tenant. Now, we saw the Hafnium attacks from January to February of 2021, and then the Novelium attacks from July to October of 2021, using similar attacks as well, where they were using one attack vector that could be an on-premise vulnerability, but rapidly pivoting into the Microsoft 365 environment because of the weak settings and the lack of monitoring that's taking place there. And so what should you do? How should you go about prioritizing hardening this situation? What I strongly recommend is that you avoid using third-party identity providers. Now, if you have to use Okta, for example, or Ping as an external identity provider, only use those for standard user identities. Never provision a third-party identity from a third-party identity provider to serve as a privileged user. Force the administrators to use the local, the Azure Active Directory provided accounts to do so. Also, I strongly recommend that you avoid using mobile security apps like Microsoft Authenticator for those privileged users. You should set policies so that privileged users are always using YubiKeys to authenticate. And what that does is it significantly reduces browser-based vulnerabilities for privileged users logging into the tenant, as well as mobile device vulnerabilities that can allow for cloning of the Microsoft Authenticator or other Authenticator app. So the next thing I strongly recommend is that you review self-service password reset policies. Now, Self-service password reset is a good thing. You should have that in place. It helps users to reset their own password, decreases the workload on help desk and the IT administration staff. But you want to make sure that all users have multiple alternate identities for password reset, and to require 2 of those identities when the password is reset. What we've seen oftentimes is an organization will enable self-service password reset, but they will only have a single factor of alternate identity that is set there. The attacker will go take over that single alternate identity, and at that point is able to take over the account for a period of time. This generally happens late at night when a user is sleeping, and they're not necessarily monitoring their device. The attacker will come, do the account takeover using the self-service password reset, and then run their attack during the course of the evening, gaining access to all of the documents they want. And it's not until the next morning when the user wakes up, realizes that their device has been locked out because the password has changed, and then they have to go about resetting the password to retake control of it. And so this is something that's very important, to make sure that you set multiple factors of identity for the self-service password reset process. The other thing that we strongly recommend is not to allow legacy SAML tokens. So the legacy SAML tokens are something that could allow an attacker to replay tokens in certain situations against third-party identity applications that could provide for problems there. It looks like we just had a question come in. Let me see if I can open that up. The recommendation to not use security apps such as Authenticator is actually something other security companies recommend using. Using a system or YubiKey are considered top. Azure now even asks for a number to verify in the app. Exactly. And so great comment, Will, there is that you really want to make sure that you're eliminating software vulnerabilities in your identity supply chain to help protect those privileged users especially. Now, one of the things that we've done is we've created our Azure Active Directory scan that looks at dozens of different problems from an Azure Active Directory. And so we have developed this scan and run with it, and it is now free to you through the month of September. So would strongly recommend, if you'd like to have an interactive view of how we would evaluate your Azure Active Directory, you can go to the link below, Vectra AI Azure AD scan, and download the scan engine. Now, what's very important to realize is that we've built this scan engine in a way where we do not have access to the vulnerabilities that are discovered there. You run it in a virtual machine. All of that data is self-contained to the virtual machine. And at no point do we have access to that. And so we've tried to develop that in a way that's different from other posture management tools that are out there that force you to build cloud-to-cloud trusts and force you to store your vulnerability information in someone else's cloud. We've tried to develop ours in a way where it doesn't add to your security problems there. And so one of the things that what we'd strongly recommend to do is to download that today. And so please follow that link. And I apologize, I just missed another question that just came through. Is YubiKey your preferred hardware authentication, or would other vendors' product work as well? So I like YubiKey because of the FIDO compliance in it. It's just easier to deploy. You can ship someone a YubiKey, they can self-service associate it with their account. But any hardware-based cryptographic token, I think, is good. So for example, inside of the security keys, you can associate like a full-blown smart card. Like if you want to require like a US government-provided CAC card or something like that, you could do that. But it is my strong opinion that privileged users should be using hardware-based tokens, whether that's a YubiKey or a smart card or a Google Titan key or any of those hardware-based cryptographic tokens are something that I'd strongly recommend to use. Great question. So let's talk a little bit about hardening the rest of Microsoft 365. So if you think about the Exchange Online situation, legacy protocols should be disabled and stay that way. Now, Microsoft is in the process of making the default configuration so that basic authentication protocols are disabled. But you've got to think that whenever you enable a legacy protocol, it essentially disables multi-factor authentication for that account, because services like IMAP and POP and ActiveSync, they don't comply with multi-factor authentication policies such as those are required through conditional access. And so you want to make sure that all of those legacy protocols are turned off and they stay that way. oftentimes what we will see happen is an attacker will come in, they will use a privileged account to go and to re-enable the legacy protocols to bypass the conditional access policies, sometimes creating their own conditional access policies that they then put certain users into. So for example, in the case of the US Treasury attack, what ended up happening was the attackers turned off auditing and logging for the Secretary of the Treasury's account, and then added him to a conditional access policy group that allowed for the use of IMAP and POP and other legacy protocols. And so you've got to make sure that you're constantly watching to make sure that those legacy protocols are turned off and they stay that way. That's one of the reasons why it's very important to consistently go and scan your tenant to make sure that the settings remain in the position that you think they are. Just had another question come through. Allowing YubiKey for privileged accounts wouldn't allow passwordless sign-in into privileged user accounts. That depends on how you have it configured. So for example, if you have a situation where you've enabled the YubiKey, and if you've turned on Windows Hello for Business, and if you have a privileged user on that system, the TPM on the laptop that they're logging into in conjunction with the YubiKey can allow for passwordless sign-on in certain situations. But I don't recommend doing that for privileged users. That's okay for a standard user, but not for a privileged one. I strongly recommend forcing the refresh of the administrative session every time someone logs in to go make a change through PowerShell. And while that does take a little bit of extra time for the user, that is a much better situation to limit the session times so that sessions can't be hijacked in the event that a privileged user's laptop is compromised. So hopefully that answers your question. And then going back to Exchange Online, you want to make sure that you monitor for over-provisioning of administrator access to material employees' inboxes. For example, in other attacks that we've seen, the bad guys will come in, they'll create like a Power Automate function. They'll then use a service principal account to scrape emails out of the CFO or the CEO's inbox, shove them over to Power Automate, and then exfiltrate them through Power Automate. And so you want to make sure that you're watching for any time that an administrator has made a change to something like a service principal account that could allow access to critical and material employees' mailboxes. Also, you want to make sure that you block malicious file types in the Exchange Online engine. Many organizations are using third-party email hygiene platforms like Proofpoint or Mimecast or any of those things. And what that does is it blocks malicious file types at the edge, but it doesn't block malicious file types from an east-west perspective. Let's say, for example, a user has a browser vulnerability that gets exploited, and then the browser vulnerability attempts to send malicious files through email to their peers. Well, in that case, if you have not turned on all of the malicious file type blocking inside of the Exchange Online engine, that doesn't hit your outside email hygiene platform. So you want to make sure that you're layering your approach so that your malicious file type blocking is set so it does not allow for east-west movement of an actor to do things like ransomware or to take over their peers' systems through email. You also want to make sure that those malicious file types are blocked through OWA. I don't know why Microsoft did this, but they are two separate policies. There's essentially malicious file type blocking for the main Exchange Online engine, as well as for Outlook Web Access, and you want to make sure you block both. And then it's my strong recommendation that you only allow managed devices or managed apps, if you're using mobile application management, to connect to Exchange Online. You can shed a tremendous amount of risk and also prevent malicious actors from cloning mailboxes and downloading massive amounts of data by assuring that only managed devices or managed applications can connect to Exchange Online. Now, obviously, to get the full benefit of that, you do need to use something like Intune to start doing a full mobile device or mobile application management policy, but there are policies that you can implement in Exchange Online without using Intune, and you should use those to the fullest degree. Next, if you want to take a look at SharePoint and OneDrive, strongly recommend that you also do malicious file type blocking there. We've seen several ransomware attacks that have begun with SharePoint or OneDrive. And also, we've seen situations where the bad guys have gotten in with a privileged account and disabled malicious file type blocking. So you should make sure that it stays that way. So again, that's part of the posture management. You've got to make sure that your preferred preferences are actually in place for the duration of how long you use it. You want to make sure that you monitor for file version retention reduction. So for example, in some of the ransomware attacks that we've seen in OneDrive, the bad guys will connect up, they will set the file version retention to 1. And at that point, they'll then encrypt the file, and there's no backup file to revert to because the file retention has been set to 1. So that's another thing that you should be doing to make sure that you're monitoring there. And then it's my strong recommendation that you actively manage the allowed domains list for trusted sharing partners. Most organizations have essentially started with a share by default situation. And that can end up in really bad situation where an attacker can set up a hostile Microsoft 365 organization, configure it so that they can gain access to things, build a B2B trust between those. And at that point, someone could have full access to the OneDrive backend to gain access to many, many files. So I strongly recommend that you look at how you manage those allowed domains. So a question, as far as posture management goes, does Microsoft 365 provide any native tripwire config monitoring capabilities? So really the only thing that we've seen Microsoft provide natively in the platform is first, if you're using PIM, so privileged identity management. And so those service tripwires, if you start to see alerts coming from PIM, if someone's trying to elevate privilege. There are some settings inside of MCAS if you're an E5 subscriber that you can use. But from our perspective, we're the only ones who have developed the capability to look at posture across both the Graph API as well as the PowerShell modules that make up the backend. And so if you really want to think about posture, there's sort of 3 aspects that you should be monitoring. Number 1 is privilege management, which is possible through PIM. Number 2 are Graph API settings that are available to look at things like mailbox access, that sort of thing. But in my opinion, the most critical aspect to watch from a posture perspective are the PowerShell modules. These are legacy protocols that are on the back end of Microsoft 365 that are fairly obscure, difficult to connect to. And that's where we spent most of our time, is to go and look at those PowerShell modules to see things like our multi-factor authentication policies being followed, our duplicate service principal accounts being created. And so it's really about looking at all of those things to watch it. And so, so that's why we've really focused on developing the platform that we have. So a lot of organizations don't have a good Microsoft 365 governance program. And so what can you do to jumpstart that? So first, governance is impossible if you don't know what the heck is going on out there. So we strongly recommend doing a complete inventory to make sure you understand all of the services that are actually used. When you sign up for an E3 license, you get access to over 27 different services. That ranges from Exchange Online to Teams and OneDrive, relatively well-known services, to Power Automate, Kaizala, and other relatively obscure platforms that maybe you don't understand are out there. So you want to make sure you truly understand what has been blocked, and you don't allow for what I call Microsoft 365 shadow IT, where essentially you have people starting to use things like Power Automate and there's no governance over that process. And so once you've had that inventory in place, that really helps you. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do with our tooling, is to basically really provide visibility into that. Next, you want to collaborate with your security policy team to define what the baseline Microsoft 365 rules are. It's a real paradigm shift when you're starting to use a cloud platform instead of the on-premises systems, because once you've touched the cloud, you are now subject to Microsoft's policies and how they decide to allow data to move from place to place inside of their cloud. And so you really want to make sure that you think about workflows, establishing approval owners for all of the different tools, such as Power Automate, and then you monitor actual usage compared to the document policy. And anytime there's a variance, you have to hold people accountable. Let's say someone, for example, decides to load a Power Automate connector that's not approved by the organization. Power Automate connectors can be extremely powerful to allow attackers to exfiltrate data, gain access to identities. And so that's where you've got to monitor and hold people accountable if they use a connector that's not properly approved. I would strongly recommend investing at least one member of your team invest in PowerShell and Graph API capabilities. This will be extremely important for threat hunting as well as for detection, response, and recovery capabilities. The Microsoft 365 environment is complicated. It's poorly documented. And so you want to make sure you've got at least one member of your team who can go and dive deeply there, because there is no single source of truth for these security settings. You've got to make sure that you've got someone on your team who can go and dig there. So let me tell you a little bit about how we've tried to do this when we've developed our Protect Scan. So we started with Azure AD, Exchange Online, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Intune, and Endpoint Manager. And we work through a 4-stage methodology every time we look at a setting. First, we evaluate, are privileges properly set here? Do we see excess privileges in place? Do we see abusive privileges, changes in privileges? Next, we basically look at attack surface reduction. Are all of the legacy protocols properly disabled? Have we done everything we can to make sure that anything that could be knocked, any door or window that could be unlocked, has been properly closed and it stays closed? The next thing we do is look at service hardening. Of those services that are approved and are enabled, have we tuned those services to use the maximum security configuration? And then we do something called transitive trust management, where we look at settings like inside of Teams. In the default configuration, once you share a file through Teams, it actually creates a SharePoint site that inherits the permissions of the Teams meeting. Well, if that Teams meeting has outside parties in it, then that means you've essentially created an anonymous access SharePoint site. That can have long-term ramifications. And so you want to make sure that you're constantly looking at the waterfall effect of what one service is doing to the other to make sure that you've hardened those things so that you don't suffer from a transitive trust problem that results from the unintended consequences of using one service and you don't understand its impacts on the other. And so what we've done is created a Vectra Protect scan report. And so if you think about the scan engine configuration, you scan the tenant, it gives you insight into key security issues. This can be done from start to finish in just a matter of hours. In some organizations, they can get it done in under an hour. Our scan engine will run at about 15,000 users an hour. Once the scan engine runs, we have clear guidance on remediation, where we've taken our expert opinion, where we say this security problem is either high or low on our risk. But if you make the change to control for that security problem, have you created an operational issue that will create a dissatisfied user? And so we take that combination of our security insights as well as our operational insights to help prioritize what are the things you can do and harden immediately without causing too much user heartache, and what are the changes that need to be project managed so that you can make those changes but properly inform the users before they're done. We've designed our platform to increase the efficiency of security teams. Our Protect customers have benefited from our thousands of hours of research and development. And we have designed it so no additional risks are introduced into the environment when the scan is run. And this screen here, the screenshot, is an example of the Vectra Protect scan that is showing the relative risks across Exchange Online, Teams, OneDrive, and Azure Active Directory. We've had success around the world. We've run thousands of scans now. And the organizations that I'm proudest of that we're helping are those in the critical infrastructure sector. We've helped security teams discover ransomware delivery paths that they didn't realize because they had weak Microsoft 365 settings that could have been exploited. We've helped many legal, accounting, and finance firms clean up their environments so that they can protect themselves against attacks such as what happened with the Panama Papers leaks. But the organizations that I'm proudest of helping are the international NGOs. We support many pro-democracy non-governmental organizations who are doing things like helping the Russian opposition leadership to basically stand up to Vladimir Putin, helping democracy coordinators and activists in places like Myanmar and other places where authoritarianism is in place. And so obviously those organizations are at very high risk because they have nation states that are coming against them. And that's where we've learned a lot about how we can really help them to make sure that we're protecting them in the long run. So the way that the Vectra Protect scan works is you log into our customer portal. Once you have an account created there, you will see your free Azure Active Directory scan that's already preloaded there. You download the scan engine to a virtual machine that's configured to our specifications. That virtual machine, if you set it up in Azure, for example, even without any discounts, it costs about $5 an hour to run. So even if you don't want to set up the virtual machine on-prem in an existing VMware environment or something like that, you can just set it up in Azure, and it's just a matter of dollars from a compute perspective per hour that you want to run it. And then, as I mentioned, the total deployment time is sometimes in just a matter of hours. You can get the scan engine downloaded, configured, and have the scan run. And at that point, you've got the report that gives you the prioritized view of what you can do to harden the environment. And so what we've tried to do is to create a situation where even an organization that's not well-resourced, that doesn't have a PowerShell expert, can gain immediate insights into the posture of their Microsoft 365 environment. And so our whole mantra has been, we want to help shine a light on Azure Active Directory security gaps. We think that it is one of the most important things that organizations should be hardening today. And so please do visit the Azure AD scan site that's linked here so that you can get access to that free AD scan. It's something that you will see can help prioritize things in a way that nothing else can. We're the only Microsoft-approved scan engine that has access to the PowerShell modules today. And as the result, that means that we have insights that no one else has. And so we've proudly helped thousands of organizations harden their Microsoft tenants in meaningful ways, providing specific details about accounts that are misconfigured, privileged users that don't have MFA turned on properly, legacy authentication protocols that have been left on. So it's basically like spring cleaning for your tenant. So I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. It's complimentary, as I mentioned, through September, but the sooner that gets run for you, the sooner you can help managing these things. So I'm going to go ahead and take some time now where we can start answering some questions. So a question from Will: are there any plans to add Microsoft 365 scanning to the Vectra appliance system? So what we're doing is we're actually working with the Microsoft 365 Detect team to build the detections into the brain that sits in the cloud environment that then gets correlated with your on-premises systems. And so what you'll see is that those two systems can then communicate. There's already great detection capabilities inside of the Microsoft 365 Detect capabilities, and so would strongly recommend you take a look at that. That demonstration can be set up very easily. They have month-long trials that you can sign up for, and you can see how the Microsoft 365 Detect can be correlated with your on-prem scanning capabilities. But great question. Let's take a look at one of the other questions here. So let's see here. What kinds of attacks have you seen through Microsoft Teams? So you should think about Teams almost like an operating system unto itself. It has the capability to install many applications inside of Teams. And so you want to make sure that you've got really good hygiene about what kinds of third-party apps are being installed inside of the Teams environment. Our suggested default configuration is to block all third-party applications from Teams and only allow approved ones. And there are other policies that you can tweak there where you can rely on certain publishers, Microsoft, for example. But we strongly recommend having better hygiene around your Teams environment. The next question here, let's see here. After September, the Azure AD scan will be separated license to be purchased. Yes, that's correct. So after September, the Azure AD scan is a separate purchase, but through that time, it is a free scan. We highly recommend that you take advantage of it while it is available on a complimentary basis. Next question, have you done any research on Power Automate and how attackers are using it? So I made some allusions to this during the presentation, but you should think about Power Automate as a massive machine learning and automation platform. If you're familiar with how machine learning tensor flows work, you can take a connector and an app and string it together, and it will create an automation that will do things like data transformation or data transfer to another location. The demonstration that I usually do when I'm showing people here is that you can, if you leave Power Automate in the default state, you can create an automation that takes every single calendar invite that comes in on your mailbox, transform it into a Google Calendar invite, and send it to your Google Calendar. Now, that's kind of cool if you're trying to synchronize your personal calendar and your work calendar, but it could serve as a significant data loss problem if you allow people to scrape, set up a Power Automate function that could scrape attachments off of emails or that sort of thing and forward them out. We've seen situations where Power Automate can be configured that actually bypasses the Azure information protection controls. And so you want to make sure that you've got really good governance over what's going on inside of Power Automate. The next question, are organizations with hybrid Exchange environments more or less vulnerable to these attacks? So it is my strong recommendation that you get rid of hybrid Exchange as soon as possible. When you're running in a hybrid situation, it essentially doubles your vulnerability count. And so in that situation, you want to shed on-premise Exchange as soon as possible. There's just so many vulnerabilities. And Microsoft has made it obvious that they are not going to support on-premise Exchange to the extent that they're supporting Exchange Online. If you take a look at the vulnerabilities over the last 6 months, most of the vulnerabilities in Exchange on-premise have already been patched inside of Exchange Online, and they were never vulnerable to it in the first place. So Microsoft has really shifted their security research towards making sure that Exchange Online is the preferred and most secure alternative within the Microsoft environment. Let's see here. There is no report demo, so we can view it during this session. So you know, I could show you a quick report here, but I think it's really important to remember that when you open up this report, it's really driven by the information inside of your Azure Active Directory. It basically takes a look at you know, dozens of different settings there, and it paints a picture of the customized one. Things like our self-service password reset policy set, our privileged users properly configured. Now, if you'd like to have a full demo before you run it, would be happy to do so. Just follow up with us afterwards, and we can make sure that that happens. Another question here: how are ransomware operators using Microsoft 365 vulnerabilities for attacks? So what we've seen happen is organizations will suffer from a ransomware attack where someone will take a privileged user account inside of Microsoft 365, go and disable or reduce the number of backup versions that are held inside of OneDrive or SharePoint, and then they'll run the ransomware attack so the organization cannot revert. And so you want to make sure that you're looking for that those changes in configurations. Also, we've seen situations where the browser vulnerability is exploited. The browser then connects to SharePoint or OneDrive using a web connection, and then runs a ransomware attack through a compromised browser session. And so that's where, if you're thinking from a zero trust situation, you want to make sure that you're you have very good hygiene around the browsers that are connected there. Great questions. So just want to make sure that we've taken care of all the questions that could be out there. If you have any more, just submit them through the Q&A box there. But I think, you know, what we want to do is position ourselves as the leaders when it comes to hardening, to identifying problems inside of the Microsoft 365 environment, helping you harden those rapidly on a prioritized basis, helping you build a system through our detect capabilities that will detect for problems there and help you respond and recover on a faster basis to limit the damage that any incident in the Microsoft cloud may have. So with that, that's what I had prepared for today. Shri, anything else you think we should cover?
Nothing else. Thank you, Aaron, for taking the time to walk through Microsoft 365 security risks. There's a lot of excellent information there. And thank you to everyone asking questions throughout the webinar as well. With looks like all the questions out of the way, thank you for joining us. As a reminder, a recording will be provided after the session, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.